welcome to all our speakers. We're ready to begin when you are.
Thank you very much for the presentation, Courtney, and thank you to the International Handball Federation for having us. It is really our pleasure to be a part of the IHF Medical Webinar Series. Now, I'm going to pull up my screen to make sure that you can see the presentation as I speak. So hopefully that should work. So I do want to start by saying that I hope everyone is safe and healthy. This is certainly a unique environment for us as we continue to deliver everything virtually and through webinars. So today we have a few key topics to cover. The main ones are main changes to the code, the prohibited list, and therapeutic use exemptions. Because we only have an hour together, each presentation will be very brief. We'll present only the most essential information that you need to know on each topic, and we'll do our best to answer as many questions as possible during the presentation as well as at the end. Now, if we're not able to answer all the questions, we will pull up our email address at the end of the presentation, so you can always contact the ITA, but you can contact IHF as well with any questions that you may have. So here you will see the agenda. As I mentioned, we will kick off with IHF-ITA collaboration and then go into the changes of the code. So of course, we're starting very broad, and then we zoom in on two specific topics, prohibited list and therapeutic use exemptions. Now, we are aware that the background professionally of the people joining us is very broad. There's also live streaming, which means that coaches are joining in, some athletes, so many members of the handball community. So that, of course, means that some of these presentations will be very familiar to some of you, while some of the information may be completely new, or most of the information may be completely new to others. So given this unique context, we did our best to make these presentations as practical and as useful as possible, but we thank you, of course, in advance for your understanding given this unique context. Of course, I am going to introduce our panel today. We have a lot of people joining and presenting. Also, we would love to know where you are from and what your role is within the sport of handball. So I would love to see that in the chat if possible. If you want to type where you're from and your role, that would be greatly appreciated. So I will introduce our speakers. You can see from left to right, as well as live with us on video, we have Lara Santi, who's the ITA testing officer, and she is responsible for the sport of handball at the International Testing Agency. She will give a very brief overview of our program with IHF and some key feedback as it relates to testing. I am, of course, Olia Abasola Avchinikova, and I am the ITA Education Manager, so I will moderate the session today. We also have Gianluca Siracusano, who is our Head of Regulatory Compliance at the ITA, and he will be presenting the major changes to the code. We also have Mark Stewart with us. He's our in-house pharmacist and ITA Operations Development Manager. He will talk about the prohibited list. And finally, we have a recording from Margot Mountjoy, who is not with us live, but she will speak to therapeutic use exemptions, and she's a sports medicine physician with a lot of experience in that field. We will also, as I mentioned, leave some time for Q&A, so if you have any questions regarding our areas of presentation, feel free to write them throughout the presentation, and we'll address them at the end. All right, so at this point, I am going to hand the floor over to Lara, who is going to present the IHF-ITA collaboration and give some feedback on her experience working with the sport of handball. Over to you, Lara. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. I think most part of you already know me, or at least already talked to me in some situation there in ITA. As Olia said, I am the key contact person in ITA regarding all the IHF matters. And I am an ex-handball player as well, not professional, but I am a passionate for this sport, and I do my best all the days to develop a good program and protect this amazing sport. And just to give you a quick overview about our program there in ITA, this is our agreement between ITA and IHF. So we have these points, the services we are delivering since the last year. We are doing out of competition testing program. And in competition tests, we will start the next year with the World Championship. We do a compliance program, which Gianluca, you talk more detailed forward. We manage the whereabout failures, and this is one of the most important key points we need to discuss. We do the therapeutic use exemptions as well. So this is another very important thing regarding the testing program. So especially for the doctors attending, if you need to submit some authorization, we have a specific email to do it, and all a special team to manage this matter. We do the results management too with our legal team. We have the athlete biological passport with another specific team to do it, and we use this to develop a good program with the risk assessment too. And now we are doing the RTP group, or registering testing pool, to improve even more the program in this matter. Then we have some most common questions arriving to me almost every day there in ITA. The most part of them are regarding the whereabouts, so it's very important to flag. We need the whereabouts submitted just in time to have an idea how to approach the teams, how to help you to deliver the whereabouts if you have some difficulties. So this is very important. Keep in touch with me and change the emails and answer my emails when I send them. We have different types of whereabouts. We have the team's whereabouts, and we can use Adams for this. I know most part of you already have the account there, and I can help you if you need to reset your passwords, to fix some issues there in Adams. So feel free to contact me anytime if you have any questions or any difficulties with your whereabouts in Adams. Another very good tool we have is the Athlete Central. This is the app which can be used for the athletes and for the managers if you prefer to not use your computer. Personally, I think it's very practical. You can just have your whereabouts in your pocket. If you need to change it in the last minute, you can just update in your phone. And it's very useful since we know, especially now with the situation with the virus, sometimes the things can change, and it's very important to keep the whereabouts updated. Another thing we ask is, I know some last minute change can happen, but we ask to do it as soon as you know the situation you change. Sometimes the system takes 24 hours to update the change in the system, and we need to know this as soon as possible. So as soon as you know something you change, please let me know, or if you have some difficulties in Adams, please let me know as soon as possible, then I can help you better. Then another point, very common regarding questions, is the athlete obligations. We have some differences here. We know some of your athletes received notifications regarding be part of the RTP or the TP group, and many of them are asking to me the difference between BTP or RTP and how this can affect the whereabouts development. The basic difference is the RTP athlete or registered testing pool athlete should provide us 1 hour time slot per day to be found in that place specific, and the TP athlete doesn't have this obligation. So yeah, but all the rest, submit the whereabouts right in time. Even quarter, we send reminders to remember the athletes to access the system, and this is the point when we can track any whereabouts issues. But all the rest is the same, like submit the whereabouts, most detailed as possible. Of course, you don't need to put I'm going to the bakery, so, or another small things in your days, but your daily routine, the main ones like training sessions, medical treatment, or any big thing like a big event or a surgery, or if you are changing your home address, or if you are spending your overnights in another place half of the week. So this is main things we need to know as detailed as possible in the whereabouts. So again, if you have any questions or any doubts how to fill it, or if something is very important to be there, please let me know, and I'm always able there in ITA to answer emails very quick, or if it's very urgent, you can just call me there, and I will be very happy to help you.
Thank you, Lara. We, of course, are happy to help with any questions or queries. Some of you, this information is very relevant if you're responsible for team whereabouts and you're a team manager or a doctor working with these athletes. So it's important for us that you support them, especially those athletes that are RTP, registered testing pool athletes, and testing pool athletes, so that we are able to have all the complete information. So if you have any specific, I know this is not the topic for today, but we wanted to highlight it. So if you have any specific questions on that, we are available. Once again, we'll put our contact information at the end of the presentation. So I will now switch it over to Gianluca to present major changes to the code. Thank you very much, Lara. And I give the floor to Gianluca. One thing I will note is that he will not stay for the Q&A session. So if you have any specific questions as it relates to the changes to the code, we ask you to send them to us right away as Gianluca is presenting, and we will take some time to answer questions if there are any before we move on to the prohibited list and the therapeutic use exemptions. So over to you, Gianluca.
Thank you very much, Alia. So while you put up the slides for me, please. First of all, good morning, good afternoon, everyone, depending on where you're joining. Thanks a lot for joining this webinar. So this section will focus on the main changes to the World Anti-Doping Code. Now, as you can imagine, such a topic is so broad that it would require potentially hours of presentation. So the goal of the presentation is really not to be an exhaustive indication of all the changes to the code. The idea is that we will walk together the main highlights, the main changes to the code, and those that are most relevant for you, both athletes and athlete support personnel, medical personnel. So I wanted to make this premise. As mentioned by Olia, we will be providing you with our contact details, and so it goes without saying, feel free to contact us if you have any further requests, if you require any clarification around any of the points that have been presented today. Unfortunately, again, for reasons of time, the level of detail will be only partial, but again, we will try to touch upon the most important changes across the presentation. So without further delay, starting from really the system of regulations, the regulatory framework. So here you can see a slide which really reflects the hierarchy of the anti-doping regulation. So as you can see at the peak of the pyramid, we have the World Anti-Doping Code. The World Anti-Doping Code is updated once every 5 years, as I'm sure you all know. And this process was just concluded in 2019, when in November, the new version of the code was adopted by WADA. And then in 2020, all international federations were required to amend their anti-doping rules, international federations and national anti-doping organizations at the national level, to adopt and update their anti-doping rules to make sure that they reflect the new code. The new code will enter into force in 2021 as of 1st January 2021. And as you can see here on the right, the IHF has already updated and amended and adopted its new anti-doping rules, which are published on the IHF website, and we strongly encourage you to go and consult the new text of the anti-doping rules. So the code, the World Anti-Doping Code, is the primary reference, the primary law, which really defines the principles that needs to be, and the requirements that needs to be followed in the implementation of any anti-doping program. Then, as a secondary level, we have the International Federation or National Organizing or National Anti-Doping Organization regulations. So in this case, the regulations of the IHF anti-doping rules. Then we have the international standards, and here you can see an overview of all the international standards. So maybe a short note here. As you surely know, anti-doping is becoming more and more technical. There is a trend of almost over-regulation. The number of standards, requirements are always increasing. And that's also part of the reason why the IHF has decided to delegate its program to the ITA to make sure that there is enough expertise in all the different areas of an anti-doping program. So these standards really reflect the different type of expertise, the different type of requirements that are mandatory in each area of an anti-doping program. So if we start from the very left, we have the international standard for testing and investigation. And again, I will not delve into the details because there could be one single presentation for each of these standards, but I just want to provide you with the global overview of what's the main principles, the contents of each of these documents. So starting from the left, we have, as I was mentioning, the international standard for testing and investigation, which really defines the plan, the rules to plan an effective testing. So this is really about testing and sample collection and how to maintain the integrity and the identity of samples, from the notifications to the athlete all the way to transporting the samples from analysis. Now, the second standard from the left is the international standard for code compliance by signatory. This is a new standard that was introduced in 2017 by WADA, and this really deals with the purpose of this document is to ensure that strong code compliance anti-doping rules are applied and enforced throughout the world consistently. So these documents provide for a series of sanctions and responsibilities for each anti-doping organization. So it really defines what are the consequences in case an anti-doping organization, so in this case, an international federation like the IHF, is not able to meet the standards or the requirements that are set in all of these regulations. So for the first time, this has been formalized in a standard. It means that anti-doping organization can be declared non-compliant if they don't meet the standards provided by WADA. Moving to the third standard, we have the international standard for therapeutic use exemption, and you will hear more in one of the next sections of this webinar. This standard really deals with the process on how to submit a therapeutic use exemption by athletes. So really how an athlete can request an exemption to use a prohibited substance for a documented clinical reason, for a medical reason. So I will not go more in detail since you will hear a presentation later on this. Moving on to the next one, the next standard is the international standard for the protection of privacy and personal information. This topic is becoming more and more important around the world, not just in anti-doping, but in all spheres of life, and in anti-doping even more. Why? Because as part of the delivery of an anti-doping program, there is a huge volume of personal data that is processed, that is collected in the delivery of the program. So these standards ensures that the collection and the processing of all this personal detail is done in a way that protects the confidentiality and the integrity of the data according to the data privacy principles that are being process on how to submit a therapeutic use exemption by athletes. So really, I'm sorry, I had a return in my headphones, but now it's fine. So I was saying really how the personal data should be processed according to the data principle standards that are being set actually around the world. The next one is the international standard for laboratories, and this really is a document, a technical document for the WADA accredited laboratories, which really deals with accreditation and standards that should be applied by laboratories. Then we have two new standards which will enter into force as of 1st of January 2021, along with the new code and the IHF anti-doping rules. This is the International Standard for Education. And the second one is the International Standard for Results Management. So the International Standard for Education is a novelty in the anti-doping ecosystem. It's the first time that WADA has decided to adopt a set of regulations only dedicated to education, which is one of the mandatory requirements in any anti-doping program. And so the International Standard for Education sets for the first time a number of harmonized principles and rules that all anti-doping organization needs to follow in educating their community of athletes and other stakeholders. So a definition for education has finally been included in the code, which is great news. And the code now focuses on the core principles that an ADO needs to follow in the education field. So as an example, each anti-doping organization needs to plan, deliver, and monitor, and actually also evaluate an education program. And the last one really deals with the disciplinary proceedings, so the International Standard for Results Management, how disciplinary proceedings should be conducted. And there are some important changes in this regard, which we will see a little bit later. Lastly, as you can see, the very last level of the hierarchical pyramid is the operational policies and implementation protocols. So this is a level where ITA has its own policies in accordance with the standards and the code, and IHF has also its own policies and protocols. So this is typically, for example, how to organize testing within an event in terms of logistics, in terms of doping control stations, in terms of sample collection materials. Wherever there is some discretion around a certain decision in the anti-doping program, this is regulated sometimes by some protocols of the anti-doping organization, or in our case, by the ITA and the IHF collectively. If we could move on to the next slide, please. So we have seen very briefly what is the regulatory framework in terms of regulations. So what are the main regulations in the anti-doping field, which I'm sure you were all familiar with. Now, if we look more into the changes, into the main changes to the code, bearing in mind the premise that I made at the beginning of my presentation. So in terms of main principles, I think a very important one, which has no operational implications, but from a principle perspective, it's very important. Health now is mentioned as a top rationale of the code. So this, of course, was already present in the 2015 version of the code, but now this concept has been even reinforced to provide all athletes around the world with the necessary confidence that it's not just about fair play, but it's also about preserving the health of the athlete. And that's where we call upon also your support, and I'm talking to the athlete support personnel and the medical personnel to always deliver this message to the athlete that anti-doping is not just about fair play, not just about sanction, but it's first and foremost about protecting the health of the people. Now, another update or change, which has quite an impact for athletes, is the adoption of a new document, the Athletes Anti-Doping Rights Act. This is a charter of rights and responsibilities of athletes, which really summarize what is expected from an athlete from an anti-doping perspective. Of course, it is a document of principles, so it doesn't go into the specific obligations or the specific requirements incumbent upon athletes, but it goes more on the principle. What are the responsibilities and also the rights of the athlete? So this is a new document which complements the code. It is not in the code, it is not a standard per se, but it is a complementary document which has been adopted for the first time. And this was, of course, after a process of consultation with the athletes community. Moving on to the changes in terms of principle, another important one is that for the first time, and I'm jumping actually to the second to last point, the delegation of doping control activities to third parties has been formalized, has been spelled out in the code. So it has been made clear that an anti-doping organization, an international federation like IHF does, can delegate the implementation of the anti-doping program to a third party, in this case, the ITA. So this was already, of course, an opportunity under the previous code, but has been formalized. There are clear rules around it. And of course, if there is any delegation to a third party, that third party is obliged to remain compliant with the World Anti-Doping Code in the delivery of the anti-doping program. Now, moving back on, another important change is that the scope of application of the code has been extended. Now, all board members, directors, officers, employees involved in the doping control process are now bound to the anti-doping rules as persons. This means that a board member or an employee that works in anti-doping, or an employee from the ITA, for example, can be charged with an anti-doping rule violation, obviously not for testing positive to a prohibited substance, but for any anti-doping rule violation that involves, for example, complicity in an anti-doping rule violation, any anti-doping rule violation on the side of the administration of the program. So, for example, tampering or facilitating any doping behavior. So this is a new requirement of the code. So all board members or staff or people involved in the delivery of an anti-doping program are now required to be bound by the code. Then we have increased standards of independence for national anti-doping organization. I will not spend too many words on this, but basically anyone who is involved in the management at the operational level or management level with an international federation, a major event organizer, a national Olympic committee, cannot be also involved in the operational decision or activities of an ADO. And lastly, I just want to remind you, but I already said that the IHF anti-doping rules will enter into force on the 1st of January 2021, along with the code. Moving on to the next slides. Now, if we look more into the anti-doping rule violations and sanctions, the biggest changes there. So first of all, there is a new anti-doping rule violation. So before we had 10 anti-doping rule violations in the code, now we have 11 anti-doping rule violations. This new anti-doping rule violation is meant to protect those athletes or person who reports doping or report any non-compliance with the code. So these persons have now been protected. In the past years, we have seen how whistleblowing, how reporting from confidential informant has become a very crucial aspect in an anti-doping program. So now there is a new anti-doping rule violation which really sanction whoever tries to stop or discourage someone from reporting doping. So whoever retaliates against them. So it's important that this message is passed over to all athletes, to the entire community of players, but also of athlete support personnel, coaches, and national federations officers, to say that this now constitutes a new anti-doping rule violation. Then if we look at the other already existing anti-doping rule violations, the concept of complicity has been extended to attempted complicity. When it comes to tampering, the definition of tampering with the anti-doping process now includes, for example, giving false statements or giving false evidence of documents, for example, in a disciplinary proceedings. So these also now constitutes an anti-doping rule violation. When it comes to prohibited association, so this is clearly when an athlete or a player associates with a person, for example, a doctor, that has been declared ineligible, or even worse, in his or her country has served, for example, a criminal sanction or a professional sanction within their own country. So in that case, now the biggest change here is that the anti-doping organization should not anymore provide advance notice to the athlete that a certain person is ineligible, so it's should not be associated with, let's say. So now it's also for the athletes, and actually there are resources on the website. You can find a list with all the athlete support personnel, medical personnel that are currently serving a suspension. So the anti-doping organization are not required anymore to provide advance notice. However, in the context of a disciplinary proceeding, they will need to prove that the athlete was in fact aware of the status of the medical personnel who was suspended. Then there are the concept of aggravating circumstances has been reintroduced in the code. This concept was actually already existing under the code in 2012 and in 2005. Then it had been removed, and now it has been reintroduced. So basically, in certain circumstances, the sanction can be can be increased up to 2 years, in addition to the standard sanction provided for in the code. And lastly, a concept that the sanctions that are imposed by a certain federation, so for example, by the IHF, are now valid and binding worldwide for all other sports. So in case there's an athlete that is competing in 2 different sports or in 2 different countries, any decision rendered by a signatory, so the IHF or a national anti-doping organization, will be valid worldwide. So the effect of decisions in the anti-doping sector are now global, so they apply globally. Moving on to the next slide. So here we look a little bit more into the prohibited list, but mostly also the sample collection process and the reanalysis of samples. I will not spend too much time on the prohibited list because you will hear from our colleague Mark later on. So I will just mention that, as you surely know, the prohibited list is updated every year. So of course, as part of the new anti-doping framework in January, a new prohibited list will come into force also on 1st January 2021. Again, I'll leave it to Mark to go a bit more detail in that context. The only aspect that I want to mention is a new concept that has been introduced, which is the substance of abuse. This is a new concept that comes from the code. It's not regulated in the prohibited list per se. So this concept is basically has been introduced to include those substances that are often abused in society, typically cocaine, heroin, MDMA, cannabis, and so on. So athletes that are found to have used one of these substances of abuse are potentially subject to a mitigated regime of sanctions. In particular, if they can prove that the use of that substance was not related to the sporting context, and that the use occurred out of competition, so not within the period of a competition, and we will look later on at the definition, the new definition of in competition, then they can receive a sanction of 3 months, which could potentially even be reduced to 1 month if they accept to participate in a rehabilitation program that has been approved by the International Federation. So this is the main change, let's say, in terms of impact from the prohibited list. Then, of course, WADA is working and continuing to work on the prohibited list. Actually, Mark is part of the experts that form the prohibited list commission at WADA. So those that are in charge really of reviewing it every year. And I would just mention that there is a process whereby it happens sometimes that substances that are taken out of competition then could appear in competition. So WADA is looking at changing or potentially setting new reporting thresholds for certain substances, but I'll stop there in that regard. Then one other aspect that I would like to mention is really around supplements. It's always useful in any context to mention that supplements can be contaminated and may cause inadvertent doping. We see these on a daily basis, especially for certain type of sports like handball. So in this regard, there is no real new change in the code. However, again, reporting limits for certain substances have been changed. If those substances are often found to be in supplements, so the so-called potential contaminants of supplements. So, this is done to protect the athletes. So this means that the athletes are now better protected because there has been an increase in certain specific threshold. However, from a legal perspective and in terms of responsibilities, the scenario is always the same. The athletes are responsible for whatever is found in their body, and they need to prove how a certain substance entered into his or her own system. So, and we know, as a matter of fact, that this can prove extremely difficult. So the only message that I would like you, once again, probably you have heard it many times, is to be extremely careful with the use of supplements, to consult experts, to potentially see in certain cases, there are certain recognized institutions that perform some testing on certain supplements and certify that a supplement is free of any prohibited substance. So I went a bit off topic, but I think it's always important to deliver this message in any anti-doping context. Moving on to the last 2 points. So there is a new definition of in-competition period. As you know, this means the period in which the in-competition laboratory analysis menu will apply, which is more extended than the out-of-competition period. As you know, certain substances are prohibited only in competition and others are prohibited in competition and out of competition. So, sorry, the out-of-competition testing menu is more extended than the in-competition testing menu. Now, before, the definition was 12 hours prior to the start of the competition through the end of the competition and the sample collection related to such competition. Now, the definition has been changed and the in-competition period starts at 11:59 on the day before the start of the competition. So that's the commencement of the in-competition period, and the ending point is the same as before. So the in-competition period lasts throughout the competition until the end of the competition and the sample collection session related to the competition. And then one last point around the reanalysis of sample. This also has been reinforced in the international standards. This, of course, was already in place in the 2015 framework. Samples can be reanalyzed within 10 years. So whenever there is a negative result, there is no limit and there is no type of notice that needs to be provided to the athletes in order to reanalyze a sample. So samples are stored or can be stored and reanalyzed as many times as an anti-doping organization wishes to do so, in case there is a negative result, up to 10 years. So this is also another message that is important to deliver to athletes to make sure that the deterrence effect there kicks in a sense that everyone should be aware that it's not just about, I'm sorry, I am having light troubles here. It's not just about the analysis of the sample at the time when it was collected. The sample can be reanalyzed in time later on when new detection methods and new laboratory capabilities are developed. So in case there is a positive result, then to conduct further analysis, there is another process. The athlete needs to be informed, but this is a legal technicality, so I will not mention it. The very last point that I want to mention on this slide, even though it's not mentioned there, is that WADA can take possession of samples, data, or anti-doping information at any time. This principle has been enshrined in the code now. Of course, it was also in the wake of the Russian scandal, but now WADA can take possession of any anti-doping information at any time. Moving on to the next slide, and I think is the second to last slide. Yes, when it comes to the legal proceedings, so this is also an area where there have been major changes in the code and in the standards. As I mentioned in the very first slide, there is a new standard, which is called the International Standard for Results Management, which now regulates in one single document all the disciplinary and I would say procedural rules of hearings and of disciplinary proceedings. So the very first important concept is that the description of the results management process, so what happens after there is a positive result, has been moved from the code to the International Standard for Results Management. So equally, you will not find any more detailed information in the IHF anti-doping rules. This information has been moved from the IHF anti-doping rules to the standard. So this is now the new reference for disciplinary proceedings. When it comes to the substance of it, the most important change is that it has been made clear that hearing panels must be operationally independent, while appeals panel must also be institutionally independent. So what does operationally independent mean? Basically, this means that the same person that was involved in the results management, in the investigation of a case, in the prosecution of a case, cannot be also involved in the hearing panel decision making. So a judge cannot be judge and prosecutor. Here there should be separation. And on top, whoever from the International Federation is involved in the management of anti-doping rule violation cannot also be the judge of a certain case. So this is operational independence. When it comes to institutional independence, this really means complete institutional separation. So there should be a separate third entity that deals with the management of appeal case. Now, when it comes to IHF, I wanted to mention you that basically the IHF has decided to, one second, because I'm checking the reference directly in the IHF anti-doping rules. So the IHF will have in place a hearing panel which meets these standards. Now, when it comes to the provisional suspension, once it is imposed by any international federation, it needs to be recognized by all international federations or NADOs. So it goes back to the effect of sanctions, which is valid globally. The same is valid for a provisional suspension. What is a provisional suspension? Is whenever pending the resolution of a case, given the circumstances, given the type of substance, for example, that has been found in the athlete sample, the athlete is suspended from the notification of an anti-doping rule, of an adverse analytical finding, I'm sorry. So this provisional suspension is already valid globally, worldwide, and the athlete cannot train or compete when they are provisionally suspended. Otherwise, no credit will be given to them for having served that provisional suspension. So this is another important concept. We get often questions from players around what does it mean to be ineligible? What does it mean to be provisionally suspended? Can I train with my club? Can I still participate in the activities of my national team, of my club? The answer is no. According to the code, to the definition of the code, being ineligible or being provisionally suspended means being banned from any activities pertaining to the sport. So this means that they cannot, and training is included in the definition. So it's very important that players have been made aware of this, because if if they are found to have trained or participated in a sports activity within a club, these then will have a negative impact, because potentially this could constitute a second anti-doping rule violation, or in case of provisional suspension, there will be no credit given to the athlete in such case. And if we move to the next slide, in terms of disciplinary proceedings, again, this is connected, this is related. Two new concepts, two new categories have also been introduced in the code: the concept of protected person and the concept of recreational athlete. So when it comes to protected person, the definition is any player that is below 16 or any player that is below 18 years old, so minors. But for the second case, if the player is not included in the IHF registered testing pool, so the pool of athletes that can be tested out of competition that are required to submit whereabouts, provided that IHF can test any player at any time throughout the year. So minor of 18 that are not included in the IHF RTP and that have never competed in an international event. Or the third reason, it has nothing to do with age, it has to do with national legislation around the legal capacity of a person. Well, if for other reasons other than age, it has been determined a lack of legal capacity under some national legislation. So this is the first category, protected person. And the second type of category is the category of recreational athletes. And this is defined by each NADO. So each NADO has the power to define what it means in terms of what this concept should mean, but they cannot include athletes who in the prior 5 years have been playing at an international or national level. So this is really meant to include those athletes that play at a very minor level, which cannot be defined as national or international level. For these two categories, there is a more lenient or balanced type of sanctioning system, in the sense that the minimum sanction goes down to a mere reprimand. And for example, there is no obligation to disclose publicly the outcome of a case. So there is a more flexible sanctioning regime. This brings me to the very last slide. which is more around the IHF anti-doping rules. As we said, these are the main changes to the code that are reflected in the IHF anti-doping rules. But here we have 2 or 3 specificities from the IHF anti-doping rules. First of all, the definition of international level player. This has an impact in terms of determining which athletes, for example, needs to submit a TUE application to IHF and not to their own NADO. Or it really clarifies what is the main scope of jurisdiction for IHF in terms of players. So here on the screen, you can see the 3 different criteria, which are alternative, that define a player as international level player. So either being part of a registered testing pool of IHF or testing pool of IHF, or otherwise competing in specific international events, World Championships, IHF Beach Handball World Championships, and the respective qualifier system. So throughout the qualification system, any event in the qualification system qualifies then a player as international level. And lastly, the IHF Wheelchair Handball World Championships. Then the last 2 points is one around whereabouts. Lara already mentioned it, and I'm seeing that my time is up, so I'll just be super quick. Lara already mentioned national federation have an obligation to cooperate in the provision of whereabouts, and failure to cooperate can result in sanctions toward the national federations. I'll stop there. I'm sorry it took some extra times. If more convenient, I'm happy to take questions offline, so by email, if we are not in schedule now.
Thank you, Gianluca. I have one question that may be very quick to answer.
Yes.
It's from Linda, and Linda asks, will athletes be informed about the 10-year retest possibility during the test as well, during doping control?
This is a very good question. It is mentioned on the doping control form. When they sign, or usually as part of an accreditation process, athletes are required, they're made bound to the anti-doping rules. So they are required to know the anti-doping rules. This is a quite unfair principle, but it is valid also for us as citizens of the world. We need to know the laws. That said, this information is provided to the athlete on top when they're tested in the doping control form. And we also make sure that in any training activity that we deliver, targeting athletes, this information is somehow mentioned. So I hope that answered the question.
Thank you, Gianluca. I know that that's a lot of information that you needed to condense in a very short period of time. So I appreciate you trying to make it as short as possible. Once again, if people have questions further down the line, not necessarily live, we will leave our contact information. So thank you again, Gianluca. I will now switch over to the prohibited list. For this, I will play you a presentation. So if you just give me one moment to load it up. And it will come from Mark Stewart, who is also with us live and able to answer any questions that you may have. So switching over to the prohibited list, and I will go from here. So go ahead.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Mark Stewart. Today, I'm going to be talking about medications and supplements and some of the things that athletes need to be aware of when taking medications and supplements. I'm going to be walking you through the prohibited list, give you a bit of an understanding of what's actually on it. So firstly, a very brief overview of who actually sets the anti-doping rules that athletes need to comply with. So the World Anti-Doping Agency, or WADA, is the independent international body responsible for harmonizing all of the anti-doping policies in all sports and in every country of the world. WADA produces the World Anti-Doping Code, and this is a really core document really that harmonizes the anti-doping policies and rules and regulations in all sports organizations around the world. So it's this document that sports organizations and national anti-doping agencies and really sign up to in their commitment to delivering clean sport for athletes. There's another set of documents called international standards, and the prohibited list fits within this suite of documents. And the prohibited list is what we'll be talking about today. So there's about 200 or 300 different types of substances on the prohibited list. And how something actually gets onto the list depends on whether it meets 2 of the following 3 criteria, which you can see on your screen. So first of all, that it has the potential to enhance sport performance, that it improves sport performance, giving one athlete an advantage over another. Secondly, that the use of the particular substance or method could represent an actual or potential health risk to the athlete. So it could cause some sort of harm to the athlete. And thirdly, that the use of the substance violates the spirit of sport. So this kind of violates the ethical use of that substance, or whether the substance is being used for the intention of doping. So it needs to meet two of these three criteria to be on the prohibited list. The prohibited list is broken into three broad categories. So the first one is those substances or methods that are prohibited at all times. So athletes, these are prohibited in athletes all throughout the year, 365 days a year, 24 hours a day. The second category is those that are prohibited only during the in-competition period. The third category are those substances which are only prohibited in particular sports. So the first category on the prohibited list are those substances and methods that are prohibited at all times. And there's a number of subcategories within this. The first of those is anabolic agents or anabolic steroids. And you may have heard of testosterone or clenbuterol as examples of those. Anabolic agents can increase the muscle mass and increase strength. And you can see how these could have a competitive advantage for some athletes in particular sports. So for those reasons, anabolic agents are on the prohibited list. The second category is peptide hormones and growth hormones, and you may have heard of EPO or erythropoietin and growth hormone. Again, this is a very broad category of substances, and there's some medications that are actually within this category as well. Beta-2 agonists. So athletes with asthma need to be particularly aware of this particular section. There's quite a number of medications used for the treatment of asthma. And if you do need to use some of these medications for the treatment of your medical condition, you may need to apply for a therapeutic use exemption. And Margot will be covering that a little bit later today. There's another section, hormones, hormone and metabolic modulators, and insulin is one of the most common examples within this category. Some athletes have got diabetes and may require insulin on a daily basis for the treatment of their medical condition. Again, a therapeutic use exemption, it would be required in that case. There's diuretics and masking agents. Again, some of these are used medically for cardiovascular conditions, for blood transfusions, and intravenous infusions in certain situations. In the hospital setting, intravenous infusions are permitted, but outside of that, they're mostly prohibited. The next category on the prohibited list are those methods and substances that are prohibited only during the in-competition period. The first section here covers stimulants. Now this particular group of drugs, stimulants, it's really important for athletes to be aware of these, particularly when purchasing over-the-counter medications in a pharmacy. There's quite a few preparations, particularly those for colds and flus or to dry up a runny nose, that actually contain prohibited stimulants, and this catches athletes out quite frequently. There's a couple of examples there. Ephedrine is prohibited in competition, so is pseudoephedrine. Pseudoephedrine, there's some restrictions around the dose and the amounts of pseudoephedrine that you can use that will affect whether it's prohibited or not. It's really important to check the fine print on any product that you buy in the pharmacies, particularly for colds and flus, to see that there's no prohibited stimulants within them. Narcotics is another category. This category contains a lot of strong pain relieving medications. One of those, for example, morphine, is often used on the field of play in emergency situations for an athlete may have a very severe injury, very painful injury. So it may be administered to you in that emergency situation to relieve your pain. It's really important for the physicians who are administering these types of medications on the field of play to athletes to record their use, because later on the athlete will have to declare that they've actually received these drugs and apply for a retroactive therapeutic use exemption after the emergency care has been provided. And Margot will be talking more about that later on. Cannabinoids such as cannabis and hashish are prohibited during the in-competition period. And glucocorticoids are also prohibited by certain routes. So these drugs are often used in sports medicine for inflammatory conditions, such as the inflammation of joints. Now, glucocorticoids can also be used on top of the skin, and they're used topically for things like itchy rashes and skin conditions. Now, when used topically, they're permitted. When used by intramuscular or intravenous injection, they're prohibited. So the routes of administration really need to be very aware of them, because it can change whether something is prohibited or permitted in sport. So I just wanted to give you some tips when reading or using the prohibited list. So first of all, not everything on the prohibited list is a medicine. Some people think that, but there's a whole range of substances on there, from medications that are used for, therapeutically for clinical conditions. But there's also things such as some veterinary medicines that are used in animals. There's some designer drugs used recreationally. There's some other chemicals that are used by laboratories to indicate to help the detection of other prohibited substances at the time of analysis. And there's some other chemicals and substances on there that are currently in research or in clinical trials and not yet registered for human use. Not every prohibited medicine is listed on the prohibited list. And I spoke about the beta-2 agonist section, which contains a lot of medications used for the treatment of asthma. Now, on the prohibited list, there's a really helpful list of some of the most common drugs used for the treatment of asthma. But it's not exhaustive, and just because you don't see your medication on the prohibited list doesn't mean that it's actually not prohibited. There's some other substances with similar chemical structure or similar effect on the body can also be prohibited. So again, just because you don't see your particular substance on the prohibited list, it may have a similar effect or similar structure to something else that is, which might make it prohibited. And only the ingredient names or the generic drug names are listed on the prohibited list. The list doesn't go into brand names. So how a substance is used can also really affect whether it's prohibited or permitted in sport. The route of administration is important. So that means whether you're taking it orally, whether it's injected, whether it's used topically, whether it's inhaled. All these different routes of administration can affect the status of your drug. And we spoke about glucocorticoids before. So as I said before, topically as a skin product, they're permitted. When used by intravenous or intramuscular injection are prohibited. And when taken by tablet orally are also prohibited. There's some drugs on the prohibited list that are prohibited only in males or prohibited only in females. And the prohibited list also contains some dose restrictions for particular drugs as well. And I mentioned the asthma medications, the beta-2 agonists. That particular section does have some restrictions around how much of the medication you can take before it becomes prohibited. And some sections actually allow for usual general medical use of some of those drugs. But that detail is actually within the list. And I think it's really important to get the guidance of your healthcare provider to be able to help you understand what those restrictions are in relation to your medicine. There's many natural products that won't be specifically listed. So if it's an animal product or a plant product or an animal extract, the prohibited list will only list the individual ingredients that may be found within some of those products. This can catch athletes out as well. Some of those natural products do have prohibited substances as ingredients, but the natural product itself won't be listed specifically on the prohibited list. The ingredients will be. And always check for updates to the prohibited list. So every January, the 1st of January every year, a revised prohibited list comes out. And generally every year, a few extra drugs or substances will be put onto the list, and sometimes things are taken off the list as well. The prohibited list can also be published at any time throughout the year. So it's really important that you have really strong communications with either your National Anti-Doping Agency or your sports federation to make sure that you receive all these updates to the prohibited list when they come out. Lastly, I just want to talk about supplements and some of the cautions and risks that athletes need to consider when deciding whether or not to take them. Supplements can take many different forms, from vitamin and mineral products to homeopathic products to plant and animal extracts or even protein powders. And one of the biggest risks of taking supplements often comes from the manufacturing process. So unlike pharmaceutical grade medicines, supplements, the manufacturing is often unregulated. And the quality of manufacture can really vary between countries and even within countries for different products. Occasionally, some products actually have prohibited substances in them that are not actually listed on the label of that product. And so many athletes get caught out every year after taking supplements and finding that they tested positive for a prohibited substance. Often this comes in because of the poor quality of the manufacturing of some of those products. The risks of taking supplements should really be weighed against the potential benefits that you may obtain from them, and taking really good advice from your healthcare professionals, such as your doctor or your pharmacist, can help you make good and informed decisions about whether that particular supplement is essential for your health. So I'm going to stop there and hand back to Olya, but really looking forward to taking any questions you might have later on in this webinar. Thank you.
Excellent. So you've just seen the presentation by Mark, who is with us live right now. Mark, I know you have some additional points to share before we move on to therapeutic use exemptions. And also there has been a question on COVID vaccines that was shared on Facebook Live. So I will give the floor to you for a couple of minutes before we go on.
Thanks, Olya. Yeah, if I might just add a few extra points as it relates to handball athletes. And actually, I was just looking back a couple of days ago, the World Anti-Doping Agency released the figures for 2018. It's always sort of a couple of years ahead that they release those figures. But some of the statistics around adverse analytical findings for handball athletes were, so for 2018, there was about almost 4,000 samples collected from athletes. And there was about 40 adverse analytical findings. So it's about 1 in 100 tests are actually coming back with an adverse finding for athletes. And some of the biggest issues, or some of the biggest problematic substances are, first of all, cannabinoids, cannabis. And a lot of handball athletes are actually testing positive for this, possibly because of their use in the recreational setting outside of the sports competition. That could be one scenario. I just wanted to add that, the 2021 prohibited list, as Gianluca mentioned, does have this new category on substances of abuse. And there's 4 substances that are currently in that category. That's cocaine, heroin, ecstasy, and cannabinoids. THC is the active ingredient within the cannabis there that is prohibited. And these new rules for 2021 means that if an athlete can demonstrate that these drugs were taken in the outer competition setting and outside of the sports setting and purely in the kind of recreational setting, or away from the whole sporting context, that the results management, the people sort of looking at the case can actually allocate a shorter sanction. So that could be potentially lowered to a 3-month sanction to athletes in those circumstances, or even in some cases a 1-month sanction if the athlete agrees to go through a treatment and rehabilitation program for their drug problem. So that's an interesting new changes coming into play for 2021. I just want to mention around some of the TUEs as well, and the International Testing Agency processes the TUEs for the international handball athletes around the world. Some of the drugs that we're seeing through that TUE process are things like glucocorticoids. These drugs are used for inflammatory kind of conditions. They're sometimes used into the joint to reduce inflammation of joints. We're seeing quite a few TUEs for those sorts of drugs. Also insulin. So, many athletes are diabetic and they need to take insulin on a daily basis. And that's a completely legitimate reason to actually apply for a therapeutic use exemption if you do have a medical condition. So insulin, some of these inflammatory conditions requiring glucocorticoids. We're also seeing some stimulants as well, things like methylphenidate, which is used for attention deficit disorder. Athletes are quite within their sort of means to kind of apply for a TUE for those, and and that can be sort of granted for those cases. So I just want to give you a bit of a context there as it related to the to handball athletes. Another big change that healthcare professionals need to look at is vilanterol is actually there's some new guidance around on the prohibited list around the use of vilanterol, which is a beta-2 agonist used for asthma. And vilanterol can now be used up until the manufacturer's recommended dose. And there's some particular wording on there. If you haven't seen it yet, I suggest have a look at that before the 1st of January. But that's one new substance that has got some new conditions around it for the prohibited list for 2021.
Thank you, Mark. Oh,
okay.
Yes.
Thanks, Olya.
Oh, good.
The COVID vaccine, should I just quickly touch on that?
Exactly, yes. So I'll just repeat the question. It's from Kevin Matthews. And it says, could COVID vaccines be a possible problem for athletes? Now, WADA recently released a statement on that, so they can be available on the website, on the WADA website. But Mark,
Yes.
if you want to expand on that, go ahead.
And I think WADA has been very clear that there's no reason at all to believe that these COVID vaccines that are coming onto the market would contravene any anti-doping rules. At the moment, they're not on the prohibited list. I think it's very unlikely that they would ever be on the prohibited list, and WADA has also, had a statement along those lines as well. As we know, there's so many of these variants of vaccines, and I know WADA has got very close relationships with some of the manufacturers and with industry, and is working very closely with them to make sure that the guidance that they put out is accurate. So have a look at the WADA website. As Ollie said, there is a statement from WADA. But at the moment, WADA does not see any problem with these being used by athletes, and there's no reason to believe that they would be prohibited in the future, is what my understanding of the WADA guidance is. Thanks, Ollie. Back to you.
Thank you. And of course, you can always read the statement to get more of the WADA perspective, and it is available on their website publicly.
I'll
Excellent.
post it in the chat room now, actually, and people can have a look at it.
Yeah, perfect. All right, so we are running just a few minutes behind schedule, but the last presentation by Margot is about 12 minutes, and we will keep monitoring questions. So thank you for staying on with us. This is our last presentation, and I will share the screen so that you can hear Margot's presentation on therapeutic use exemption. So just give me 1 second. It seems to have disappeared from my options, but I will find it. Perhaps I will just share the screen.
So I'm going to take us through some of the key tips on therapeutic use exemptions. What it is, why do we need to have one, who needs to have one, when do you apply, how do you apply, and finally, I'll end up with some practical tips. So what is a therapeutic use exemption? Well, as an athlete, if you have a particular illness or an injury that requires a specific medication, and if that medication is on the prohibited list, you can apply for permission and be granted permission as a therapeutic use exemption to use that drug within the context of sport regulations. So this therapeutic use exemption allows you to compete and train while using the prohibited substance. If you're an athlete that's subject to doping control, then you are the athlete who must request a TUE before you take the medication. And please be reassured that all of the information in the TUE process remains strictly confidential. There are some criteria that must be met before you get a TUE. For example, your health, you have to prove that your health would be significantly impaired if you did not take the substance. You have to prove that your substance does not enhance your performance beyond what brings you back to a normal level of health compared to your other athletes. You have to show that there are no alternative treatments available that are not prohibited. And finally, you need to show that the need for the use of the prohibited substance is not resulting from the prior use of a prohibited substance. So what are some of the common health conditions that may require the use of a prohibited substance and therefore require the application for a TUE? Well, one fairly common in athletes is asthma, attention deficit disorder, diabetes, infertility or polycystic ovary syndrome, inflammatory bowel disease, intravenous infusions outside of the hospital, certain musculoskeletal conditions, and acute sinusitis. Now, you're not actually granted permission to have these illnesses. You're actually granted permission to use a substance that's used to treat these illnesses within the sporting context. So you can then compete and train while using that substance. So what I've just brought up, this box in green, is on the WADA website. And this cross-references the diagnosis that I've mentioned here with the specific drug that's on the prohibited list. So what I've shown you here is not an exhaustive list. There are many more conditions than listed on my slide here. And of course, there's many more medications that are prohibited that are not on this slide. But this gives you an example that if you as an athlete has attention deficit disorder, you may be prescribed dexamphetamine or methylphenidate, in which case then you would need a TUE to use that drug if you were going to compete and train with this substance. The guidelines suggest that you must apply at least 30 days before taking part in an event. I encourage you to apply for TUE as soon as you are prescribed the prohibited substance. Don't wait for the event. You can request the TUE from your anti-doping organization or through the ATOMs. And if you're an ITA partner federation, you can go to the website at the International Testing Agency to request a TUE. When you're filling out the TUE, both the athlete and the physician must complete separate parts of the therapeutic use exemption form. And then the form gets sent to the anti-doping organization that you're responsible for. So very important that it's the athlete's responsibility to get the TUE completed, and you must get your physician to fill out the medical part. And as an athlete, then you must send your TUE form into the anti-doping organization that you answer to. You may be a national level athlete and you answer to the national anti-doping organization of your country. Or if you're an elite international level athlete and you are in a registered testing pool where you send your whereabouts information on a daily basis, then you may be applying to the International Federation. So if you have any questions, you should ask your local anti-doping organization, who do you apply to? And they will be happy to direct you to the correct anti-doping organization. Please include all of the details in your documentation. If you don't have all of the details, the TUE will not be granted. It'll be returned to you, the application, for you to complete the application with full documentation. At that stage, a panel of experts will review the file and they will grant the TUE for a specific substance at a specific dose for a specific duration. So that's very important. It's not a free opportunity to use as much of the drug for as long as you like. It's a specific substance at a specific dose for a very well-defined period of time or duration. So if you are applying for a TUE, it's very nice that WADA has developed this checklist. Now I give you an example here, and I know it's difficult to read, but each checklist is for a different diagnosis. They can be found at the website at the bottom of the page. And what this checklist is categorized by the health conditions. So this one in particular is for intravenous infusions, but they can also be for many others are on file at this WADA website. And they come in different languages. so that depending on where you are in the world, it is already translated for your physician, so they can make sure that they have the right criteria included and diagnostic supporting information. And you also can make sure that everything that's required for that particular substance, for that diagnosis, is included in your TUE form. Very helpful information here. Please use this website and this checklist. It saves a lot of time if you fill it out right and completely the first time, so that you can avoid time delays when you're going back and forth for missing documentation. There is something called a retroactive TUE. So what if it is an emergency situation and you don't have time to apply? So if there's emergency treatment that's required, you can then activate what's called a retroactive therapeutic use exemption. So even if it's not quite an emergency, but there's insufficient time or opportunity for you as an athlete to submit your TUE, or insufficient time for the Therapeutic Use Exemption Committee to review your application prior to the time you had your sample collected, then you can be granted a retroactive TUE. And this is very important. If you were prescribed something, you started the process going, and then all of a sudden you were tested the next day before you heard back, you can be reassured that as long as you've had the process in motion, that you will be granted a retroactive TUE, as long as you meet the criteria. And the final way you get a retroactive TUE is if both WADA and the anti-doping organization to whom you're applying, they feel that it is in fairness to require the granting of a retroactive TUE. So this last caveat gives some room for interpretation, gives some room for the anti-doping organizations to decide that, in this situation, it was actually fair and there was no opportunity otherwise to apply for this TUE. So it is a very nice caveat that is in the IS, or International Standard for Therapeutic Use Exemption. We're going to close now with some tips, some practical tips to help you. First of all, make sure you keep your medical records up to date. Please attend your physician's appointments regularly and follow through on any procedures or diagnostic tests that are required for your illness. If the medical records are up to date, it's much easier to prove that you need the prohibited substance for that condition. Please remind your physician to look at the WADA medical information guidelines. Very helpful for physicians to know what they're supposed to include. Very importantly for everyone listening to this today, please check the WADA prohibited lists when you receive a prescription. A lot of physicians do not know the prohibited list well enough to recognize when they may have given you something that's prohibited. As an athlete, it's your responsibility to say, hey, I'm an athlete that's subject to drug testing. Is what you're prescribing on this piece of paper here? Let's check if it's on the prohibited list before you take it. As I mentioned before, and it is certainly worth repeating, please make sure your application is complete and accurately filled out. If you have a change in dose, you have to apply for a new TUE. And this is really important. As I said before, you're granted a TUE for a specific substance at a specific dose for a specific duration of time. So if your physician changes your dose, you then have to reapply for a new TUE. Keep track of your expiry date. Remember, the TUE is granted for a specific period of time. So if your TUE expires, then you are not protected under the therapeutic use exemptions. Please renew your TUE before it expires. So what if you're being tested? What should you do if you have a TUE? Well, number one, declare your medication on the doping control form. Please write down everything you've taken, and particularly that you've taken this TUE substance, this prohibited substance for which you have a TUE. Please declare it on the form. And then on the form next to that substance, specify that you have a TUE that's been granted. That's very helpful to say, I'm taking this substance, it's prohibited, I have a TUE for this substance. And should you happen to have a copy with you, please show a copy of your TUE approval to the doping control officer.
Excellent. So that wraps up the presentation on therapeutic use exemptions by Margot. And there you go. Excellent. So we went just a little bit over time there with the presentations. The first half was really, really technical in the rules, and I believe the second part is a lot more applicable to athletes, if there are any listening today on the live feeds. If you are team managers, team doctors, administrators, we really ask you, the session is recorded, we ask you to show at least the tips for prohibited list and the tips for therapeutic use exemptions to your athletes, so that they are also more knowledgeable and empowered in this process. It is a bit more complicated, but those key points hopefully are digestible enough for athletes to take a bit more control over their journey as clean athletes in the sport of handball. So Courtney, I think we have some questions, or are we all good?
We're actually all good. So I think everyone did a great job explaining all of their concepts. So we can wrap up there.
Excellent. If you want, we can pop up on the screen the further learning and development, and then we can wrap it up. Would that work?
Yes, sure. That's great. Thank you.
Excellent. So I will share my screen for one last time. If you just give me 1 second. Okay, so the last minute of our time, I just wanted to show here some of the other resources that are available. Of course, WADA has ADEL, which has now been renamed to the World Anti-Doping Education and Learning Platform, which is being upgraded to ADEL 2.0 in 2021. And Mark, I believe you have a few comments on the medical courses specifically.
Oh, I was just going to mention, I think if there's any physicians here who'll be traveling to Tokyo for the Olympics next year, WADA has also published a really good resource called Medical Professionals at Major Games. And this is going to be, it's mandatory basically for all physicians who are practicing at the Olympic Games, and it covers TUEs, the prohibited list, and also some information about bringing medicines to the games, importing your medicines into host countries at the Olympic Games. So if you haven't already seen those, I'd really recommend that you take a look.
Excellent. And of course, the important documents for all of you listening in are the new code, the new standards. Please review them carefully, especially in the areas that affect your specific areas, and the IHF anti-doping rules. So if you have any questions, once again, now is the time that I will show our email address here. Please feel free to get in touch from this mailbox specifically that goes to us at the education team, but we will dispatch as needed if they are, let's say, Adam's questions, the LADA will receive, or anything medical will go to Mark and Science and Medical team. And of course, the legal team is also available for anything as it relates to the changes. So that brings it to the end of our presentation. Thank you very much once again for having us on. And Courtney, I will hand it over to you to close.
Thank you so much, everyone. And I will just add further contact information that if your question is maybe more related to something that IHF can answer, then you can reach out to the IHF office @ihf.info. So thank you once again to all our speakers and pre-recorded speakers. And I will just wrap up. This is our last of the first IHF medical webinar series. So I do have a short message from Dr. Hosni, the chair of the IHF anti-doping unit. He says that he would like to thank all the colleagues and the doctors and professors for their participation and scientific input during the entire period of these seminars, and a special thanks to the specific team. Also, I will say that from me as well, for the IHF team behind these seminars, for their professional and technical work and good administration in organising this. And this reflects the success of this first IHF medical webinar series. Thank you so much to all the participants from around the world who have joined us today and previously, the colleagues from handball federations, and specifically the teams, the 32 teams that will participate in the 27th IHF Men's World Championship coming up in January 2021. And Dr. Hosny says he is so glad that his dream to conduct this course could take place. So thank you everyone today for making that happen, and everyone before. And everyone, please keep an eye on the IHF website for upcoming programs forming part of this virtual academy, and we will see you again soon. Thank you, everyone.